they can represent the ultimate in violence. Or they can be a message meant to inspire fear.
They all have one thing in common. They are hate crimes. They can happen anywhere, and anyone can be a target.
And the number one thing you need to understand about hate crimes is they are different from any other crime you will deal with as a law enforcement officer. I'm Dave D'Amico, former detective with the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office in New Jersey.
I'm Sergeant Thomas Coe, Office of the Attorney General, State of New Jersey, Division of Criminal Justice.
Tom and I have been doing biased crime investigations and training biased crime officers and detectives for well over 20 years. We've been lucky enough to be partnered with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Tom was always there for me. He trained me from the onset, and I'm lucky to call him my friend of well over 20 years.
I think he's one of the best trainers in the country.
Hate crimes are message crimes. They send a message to an entire group of people, not just the victim. You can have a large part of your community that feels targeted. Victims and members of their community will feel helpless and afraid. They will need your assistance and want answers. If you respond properly, it will reduce the fear and tension. It sends a clear message that law enforcement takes this seriously.
At the end of the day, everybody in society is affected by people who select their victims for no other reason than who they are.
The FBI documented 5,850 hate crime incidents in 2015. Almost 60% were motivated by bias against the victim's race, ethnicity, and ancestry. Religious bias accounted for about 20%. Anti-Semitic acts made up more than half of that. The FBI report showed anti-Muslim hate crimes increased by 67% from 2014 to 2015. That's the highest it's been since 9/11. So what should you as an officer do when a hate crime occurs in your community? Remember the 3 R's: recognize, respond, and report. The most important thing you as the initial responding officer can do is recognize what you're dealing with. If it is handled like any other call, it doesn't do the victim or the victim's community justice. So you have to determine if it is a hate crime or a hate incident. The FBI defines a hate crime as a criminal offense against a person or property, motivated in whole or in part by an offender's bias against a race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Hate incidents are motivated by bias but aren't criminal offenses. So not every incident is a hate crime, but every hate crime is a hate incident. How do you tell if it's a hate crime? Look for the motivation behind the act. Is the motivation of the alleged offender known? Was the incident known to have been motivated by race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity bias? Does the victim perceive the action of the offender to have been motivated by bias? Is there no clear other motivation for what occurred? Were any racial, religious, disability, sexual orientation, ethnic, gender, or gender identity bias remarks made by the offender? Were there any offensive symbols, words, or acts which are known to represent a hate group or other evidence of bias against the victim's group? Did the incident occur on a holiday or other day of significance to the victim or offender's group? What do the demographics of the area tell you about the incident? If you believe the incident may be motivated by hate or bias, it is crucial you respond promptly and properly. While your investigative techniques may be standard, your response shouldn't be.
And one of the first cases I had as a bias detective was a case where a black woman moved into a white neighborhood. They built a new house. Her husband worked nights. And while he was at work one night, a group of skinheads surrounded her house and threw rocks through every window. She was sitting in the living room with her newborn, and glass shattered all around them. The police came, and they said a bunch of kids vandalism. Well, a bunch of kids don't throw rocks through every window in the house. We found out who it was. It was a bias incident, but it wasn't a bias crime because we couldn't prove their motivation. But I felt so bad for that lady. So I kept up with her, and 5 years later, I had called her, spoke with her, she remembered me. Thanks for calling. But she did say, when I asked, do you ever think about the incident? And she says, there's not a day I wake up or a night I go to bed that I don't think about it. So hate crimes never leave the victim.
It is important to remember that hate crimes can be emotionally devastating to the victim. They are afraid and feel isolated. They wonder why they were selected for no other reason than who they are. Because hate crimes are so personal, the responding officer must establish contact with the victim as early as possible. You need to let them vent and be supportive throughout the process. And because the impact of these crimes is so far-reaching, both the victim and their community need to know you are concerned about what has happened. Have a list of resources such as victim advocates, community relations officers, and contacts within various civic and religious groups that you can connect the victim with. Keep these contacts updated on the investigation as much as possible. Notify your supervising officer immediately so they can assist in determining if it is a hate incident. You may want to notify public officials of possible publicity and heightened tension within the community. Work with the media. They will be covering the incident closely, so give them frequent updates. That way, the affected community and the community at large will stay informed. You should also preserve the evidence at the scene quickly and be on the lookout for hate symbols, literature, or slogans. If you can't remove the evidence, photograph it thoroughly to document any bias indicators. Ask the victim, relatives, and neighbors if incidents like these have happened before in the area or if they have received previous threats. Once you recognize the possibility the incident was motivated by hate or bias and respond properly, you must take the third step and report it correctly. The initial responding officer should prepare a detailed report that includes any of the bias indicators. If those indicators are present, the officer should classify it as a possible hate incident. The report should then be sent to a supervisor, or ideally an officer trained in hate crime investigations. That person should make the final determination if it qualifies as a hate crime. Finally, the report needs to be sent to the FBI. All hate crime reporting is done electronically, and it should include the following information: the offense type and its respective bias motivation, location of the incident, the number and type of victims, the number of known offenders, the known offender's race and ethnicity, whether or not the victim and offender were under 18 years of age or over. The Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1990 require that the FBI collect hate crime data from all states, but it didn't make it mandatory for states to provide that data. The participation is voluntary. According to the latest FBI report, almost 15,000 law enforcement agencies participated in 2015, but 88% of those agencies reported no hate crime incidents, and Hawaii doesn't participate in the program at all. A 2013 study of the DOJ's Bureau of Justice Statistics showed hate crimes are being underreported by a staggering amount. More than 250,000 hate crime victimizations were recorded. The FBI's documented hate crime incidents, in comparison, range from about 6,000 to 10,000 a year. Documenting and then reporting is the only way we will be able to access how serious a problem hate crimes are for our nation and its people.
You can't leave it to anybody else. If it is to be, it's up to me. If change is going to be made, you have to initiate it. You have to do something about it.
The federal government has enacted various legislation over the years that addresses hate crimes. Most states are following suit. As of 2016, 45 states and the District of Columbia have adopted some type of hate crime legislation. But 16 states don't include sexual orientation or gender identity in their hate crime laws. And 5 states, Arkansas, Georgia, Indiana, South Carolina, and Wyoming, still don't have any hate crime laws. So what can be done to reduce the impact of hate crimes or even help prevent them? Get to know your community groups and religious organizations. That way, if a hate crime occurs, you will already have a contact who can serve as a resource to the victim and a liaison to the community targeted. Members of organized hate groups commit only a fraction of hate crimes today, but don't discount their presence or the influence of hate speech. And remember why hate crimes still occur. Hate is a learned behavior, so young people are especially vulnerable. In 2015, almost 85% of hate crime offenders were older than 18 years old. However, in New Jersey, most offenders are juveniles. As part of a diversion program in Monmouth County called Walk a Day in the Victim's Shoes, each juvenile offender, instead of going to a youth detention center, was sent to a local community college where they completed a 12-week course on victimization. And law enforcement is getting involved in other ways. Lieutenant Brian Murphy was the first responder when a racist skinhead in 2012 opened fire at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin. 6 worshipers were killed and 4 were wounded, including Murphy. He was shot 15 times, 12 of those shots missing his bulletproof vest. Lieutenant Murphy is now retired and committed to educating people, especially law enforcement, about the Sikh culture and community. If your agency, especially the initial responder, handles this entire process correctly, you can accomplish so much. You can reduce fear and anger. You facilitate the recovery of the victims, witnesses, and the community. You reduce a potential for retaliation. You generate trust between community and the police at a crucial time when trust may be broken. You convince the victims that the community and law enforcement takes their concerns seriously. But most importantly, you send a clear message to the offender that hate and bias crimes will not be tolerated.
Hate crimes can tear apart a community. At our trainings, we tell officers, you don't have to love or even like everybody. You don't have to agree with their beliefs. But what you must do is remember that everyone can be a victim.
Prejudice and the definition of prejudice is to prejudge. So when you look at someone or something you know absolutely nothing about that person or that thing, yet you start to formulate an opinion in your head. A lot of times that opinion is driven by things that you've been taught. A lot of times my audience will say, recognize immediately that I'm a police officer, whether it be by my haircut or by my command presence, by the way I talk, by the voice or the voice overtones that I use when I present. But none of them know or think that I'm openly gay. So I started off in 1989. In 1989, it wasn't okay to be gay. And it definitely wasn't okay to be gay in law enforcement. And I heard comments, and I heard innuendos, and I heard things that made me feel uncomfortable. At certain times, I thought maybe I don't belong in this profession. That did not break me. It made me stronger. But that also helps me to understand what it's like to walk a day in the victim's shoes. It helps me understand what it's like to be that victim who's selected for no other reason than who they are, or can't change who they are, shouldn't have to change who they are based on our diversity in the United States and based on our Constitution and the laws that go along with our Constitution.
We as law enforcement are sworn to protect everyone equally. If you don't, you're not upholding your oath to them or to yourself. Don't let hate take your community.